The ballroom at Creighton House blazed with candlelight, each flame reflected in the polished parquet like stars trapped beneath foot. Miss Helena Ashworth stood near a marble pillar, her gown of pale willow green chosen for economy rather than fashion. She was no one's prospect, and she had made peace with that long ago, or so she told herself on evenings such as this, when the laughter of other young ladies rang like crystal tapped too carelessly. She had been handed a glass of ratafia by a footman who never met her eyes and now held it untouched, watching the dancers move through a quadrille with the precision of painted automata. Her mother, widowed and anxious, had urged her to attend, hoping for a miracle. Helena knew miracles required capital, and her dowry would barely furnish a modest cottage. So she observed. It was a skill she had honed, noticing the flickers of genuine emotion behind the ton's gilded masks. A voice drifted from behind the pillar, sharp as broken oyster shell. Good heavens, is that the Ashworth creature still planted there? One might mistake her for a fern. Another titter. She's hardly a fern. Ferns have a certain unstudied grace. That one simply fades into the wallpaper. Helena's jaw tightened, but she did not turn. She set her glass aside and moved toward the French doors that led to the conservatory. The air inside was cooler, heavy with the scent of orange blossoms and damp earth. Rows of potted camellias formed a makeshift maze, and she walked deeper, letting the shadows absorb her. There was a bench near a trickling fountain, and she sat, closing her eyes to push back the sting of humiliation. She would not cry. Tears were a currency the ton collected with relish, and she would not pay. Footsteps, deliberate male, the faint click of Hessian boots. She opened her eyes. A man stood at the turn of the path, broad-shouldered in a coat of midnight superfine. He was tall, his features cut with an arrogance that seemed innate, a straight nose, a jaw that did not compromise, eyes the color of rain-washed slate. Alexander St. Clair, the Duke of Ashcombe. The entire ballroom had stirred when he arrived late, whispers snaking through the assembly like wind through wheat. His presence here alone was an intrusion. He studied her with a directness that bordered on rude. "You have abandoned the festivities, miss." "Ashworth," she supplied, rising. She did not curtsy. "I was not aware the conservatory required an invitation." His mouth flickered. "It does not, though most young ladies prefer the dance floor to the shrubbery. Most young ladies have not had their gowns compared unfavorably to foliage. I find the shrubbery better company." A pause. He moved a step closer, and the fountain's soft spill filled the silence. A fern, was it? The comparison lacks imagination. Ferns possess a quiet tenacity. They survive where showier blooms wither. Helena tilted her head. "Are you complimenting me, your grace, or merely proving your horticultural knowledge?" "I never flatter. It is a waste of breath and invites expectation." His gaze swept over her face with unnerving attention. "You are the one who refused to dance with Lord Halford when he trod on your slipper 3 times last season and claimed it was the floor's fault. You know of that." "I make it my business to know things the rest of the ton overlooks." He said it as though remarking on the weather, but there was a current beneath the words, a coiled awareness. "You have a memory for slights, and yet you do not retaliate. Why?" Helena held herself still. "Retaliation suggests the slight mattered. I simply chose not to repeat the experience. Lord Halford's feet remain his own concern." The Duke let out a sound that was not quite a laugh, a low rumble of acknowledgement. "You are an original, Miss Ashworth. This season has been tediously predictable." He paused, and his next words landed with the weight of a gauntlet thrown at her feet. "I suspect you will not be." He turned and left before she could respond, his boots echoing on the flagstones. Helena stood motionless, the scent of orange blossoms suddenly cloying. The Duke of Ashcombe had spoken to her as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve. The thought should have alarmed her more than it did. Instead, it kindled a cautious, unwanted warmth beneath her ribs, a sensation she had not felt in years. She remained in the conservatory until she heard the distant announcement of supper. When she rejoined the ballroom, her mother's worried gaze found her. The Duke was across the room, Miss Caroline Bexley on his arm, her golden curls and sapphire necklace a beacon of wealth. Yet as Helena passed the refreshment table, she felt his eyes on her, brief as a held breath, deliberate as a touch. Something had begun. She did not know its name, but she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, that the quiet season she had braced for was already lost. 3 evenings later, Lady Hartwick's musicale offered Helena no refuge. The drawing-room overflowed with gilded chairs and gilded opinions, and a young soprano was attempting an Italian aria with more volume than accuracy. Helena had positioned herself near a window, the cool pane a relief against her back, when the Duke materialized beside her. He did not announce himself with pleasantries. He simply stood, his shoulder almost brushing hers, and watched the performer with an expression of pained forbearance. "That note," he murmured, "was never intended by the composer. It was invented on the spot, a new and regrettable creation." Helena pressed her lips together. "You are uncharitable, Your Grace. She is nervous." "Nervousness does not excuse murder. She is killing Mozart by slow degrees." A startled laugh escaped her before she could trap it, and several heads turned. Among them, Miss Caroline Bexley, seated in the front row beside her formidable mother, twisted to look. Her gaze pinned Helena with the cold precision of an entomologist examining a specimen. Lady Bexley's mouth puckered as though tasting something sour. The Duke, unperturbed, continued, "I require air that is not saturated with eau de Cologne and ambition. The terrace, accompany me." It was not a request. Helena should have refused. Every rule of propriety demanded it. But the soprano had reached a particularly tortured crescendo, and the prospect of escape overrode caution. She followed him through a side door onto a stone terrace strung with lanterns. The night air smelled of rain and clipped boxwood. "You do that deliberately," she said when they were alone. "Command rather than ask, you assume compliance." He turned to face her, the lantern light carving shadows beneath his cheekbones. "I assume nothing. I observe that you chose to come. Because the alternative was auditory assault, not because I am at your disposal. I would never make that mistake." The words were quiet, but they carried an undercurrent she could not decipher. He moved to the stone balustrade and looked out over the darkened garden. "Miss Bexley's mother is already drafting the engagement announcement. She has selected the wording, the paper stock, and probably the pattern of the wedding china. I am not expected to have an opinion." Helena joined him at the railing, keeping a careful distance. "That must be tiresome." "It is a transaction. My estate requires an infusion of capital. Miss Bexley's dowry is substantial. The mathematics are uncomplicated." He said it with a flatness that was somehow worse than cynicism. "Sentiment has no place in my arithmetic." "Then why are you out here with me instead of cementing your equation?" The question was bold, perhaps reckless, but Helena had spent years being invisible. She was tired of biting her tongue. The Duke turned his head and the full weight of his attention settled on her. "Because you do not simper. You do not calculate. When you look at me, you see a man, not a title in want of a fortune. It is disorienting." Before she could respond, footsteps sounded on the flagstones. Lord Philip Wrexham emerged from the drawing-room, his pleasant, open face creased with concern. "Miss Ashworth, your mother was inquiring after you. I said I would," he broke off, registering the Duke's presence. His posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion." The Duke's expression shuddered. "Lord Wrexham, ever the gallant." The words were smooth, but a blade lay beneath. Lord Wrexham offered his arm to Helena with the ease of long acquaintance. "I promised your mother I would escort you back before the second half begins. She worries the chill will aggravate your throat." It was a flimsy excuse, but Helena seized it. She took his arm, and as they moved toward the door, the Duke's voice followed her, low and private. "Miss Ashworth, a man does not always have the luxury of choice, but when he does, he should be certain what he is choosing." She did not turn back. Inside, the soprano had mercifully finished, and the buzz of conversation filled the room like steam. Lord Wrexham leaned close. "Forgive my interference. Ashcombe is not safe company for someone of your position. He will not marry where there is no profit. I would not see you hurt." Helena thanked him with a nod, but her mind remained on the terrace, on the Duke's admission of disorientation. She could not afford to be a distraction for a man who measured his life in arithmetic. As the second half began, she caught Lady Bexley's voice, pitched to Carrie. "Miss Ashworth seems remarkably forward this season. One wonders if her mother has entirely forgotten the principles of chaperonage." The words landed like a brand. Lord Wrexham stiffened beside her. Across the room, the Duke's jaw tightened, but he did not intervene. He could not without confirming the very gossip Lady Bexley intended to seed. Helena sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, and endured. The soprano began another aria. The musicale dragged on, and somewhere between the third false note and the final applause, she resolved that Alexander St. Clair, Duke of Ashcombe, would not be the instrument of her undoing. She would see to it herself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the silver salver that held the Morning Post. Helena's mother did not notice it among her own correspondence, a thin folded sheet sealed with a blob of amber wax bearing no crest. Helena carried it to the window seat, her pulse unsteady before she even broke the seal. The handwriting inside was not the Duke. It belonged to a steward named Harris, and it was addressed to Ashcombe House. "Your Grace, the mortgage on the North Fields cannot be extended beyond Michaelmas. I have done as you instructed and sold the remaining timber, but it will not cover the interest. I urge you to finalize the arrangement with Miss Bexley's family before word reaches the creditors. The estate cannot withstand another quarter of scrutiny." She refolded the paper with trembling fingers. The piece had been misdelivered, perhaps by a careless footman, perhaps by fate, and now it sat in her lap like a live coal. The Duke's desperation was no mere rumor. It was a chasm beneath polished floors. That afternoon, Lord Wrexham called. He came with a posy of hothouse violets and a nervous energy that made his kind face boyish. They sat in the small back parlor while Helena's mother knitted in the corner, her needles clicking a steady rhythm. "Miss Ashworth," he began, "I have no great estate, but my prospects are sound. I hold you in the highest regard. If you would consider, that is, if you might permit me to speak to your mother." Helena's throat tightened. Philip Wrexham was everything a sensible woman could want: steady, respectful, uncomplicated. She laid the posy gently on the side table. "Lord Wrexham, you deserve a wife who can offer you more than regard. I am not in a position to accept any offer at present, and I will not keep you in suspense while I resolve matters I cannot explain." His face fell, but he nodded. "Is it Ashcombe? I saw the way he looked at you at the Hartwick affair. He will not defy his family, Helena, you must know that." "I am not waiting for him to defy anything," she said, and it was the truth. "I am simply not free to give you the answer you merit. Please, do not press me further." He left with a heavy step, and Helena's mother said nothing, though her needles paused. The silence was worse than any interrogation. The Duke arrived at dusk. Helena was in the walled garden behind the house, a narrow enclosure of lavender and rosemary that her father had planted before his death. She heard his boots on the gravel path and did not turn. "You come here unbidden and without a chaperone," she said, her hands brushing the lavender spikes. "You truly do not care for consequence." "I sent word to your mother. She permitted the visit on the condition that I speak with you in her sight from the window." His voice was taut. "I am not entirely without decency." She turned then. He stood at the garden's entrance, dressed for riding, his coat dark against the dusk. "Why are you here?" "Because I have not slept, because I keep hearing your voice tell me I am a man who does not ask." He stepped closer, and the scent of lavender rose between them. "You were correct. I have treated you as a diversion, a balm for a wound I have no right to nurse. My circumstances—" "Your circumstances are known to me," she interrupted, and his eyes widened. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the steward's letter. "This was delivered to my home by mistake. I know about the North Fields, the timber sale, and the expectation that Miss Bexley's fortune will save you by Michaelmas." The Duke went very still. He took the letter and scanned it, his expression hardening. "You had no right to read this." "No right? It arrived under my roof. The fault is not mine, your grace, but the truth is now shared and it changes nothing. I will not be your escape route or your rebellion. I will not be the reason your tenants suffer when the creditors call. You think so little of me that I would blame you for a disaster I inherited." His voice cracked, a fissure in the marble facade. "I came here to tell you that I am done with arithmetic, that I would rather lose every field than purchase a marriage that tastes of ash, and you throw my own ruin in my face as if it were a weapon." Helena held herself steady. "You came here to make a grand declaration, but you still do not ask. You announce, you decide, you assume. I am not a variable in your redemption. If you wish to defy your family and the ton, do it for yourself, not because I have become a symbol of what you might sacrifice." He stared at her, and the silence stretched so long that a nightingale began to sing in the yew hedge. Then he laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You are merciless." "I am honest. That is what you claim to value." The Duke folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. He did not argue. He did not plead. He looked at her with an expression that was stripped of arrogance, raw as the underside of a stone. "If I learn to ask, Helena, truly ask, will you listen?" She did not answer. She could not. The nightingale sang on, and after a long moment he turned and walked away. His figure dwindled down the gravel path, and the lavender released its fragrance into the cooling air, a scent she would forever associate with the ache of unshed tears. The Ashcombe townhouse on Grosvenor Square blazed with 1,000 candles on the night of the ball. Carriages clogged the street, depositing silks and jewels onto the red-carpeted steps. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into a fantasy of hothouse roses and gilded mirrors, the Duke's wealth, or what remained of it, put on defiant display. The ton had come in full force, drawn by the unspoken certainty that an engagement announcement hovered in the air like a coming storm. Helena arrived on the arm of Lord Wrexham, her gown a deep shade of claret that had cost her mother 3 months of economies. She had not wanted to attend. Every instinct urged her to send her regrets, to remain in the quiet safety of the walled garden. But absence would be read as guilt or, worse, defeat. She would not hide. Miss Caroline Bexley held court near the orchestra, a vision in ivory silk and diamonds, her mother stationed beside her like a general surveying a conquered field. The glances they cast toward the Duke, who stood near the hearth in conversation with his grim-faced solicitor, were proprietary, satisfied. The announcement was imminent. The ton could feel it. Helena accepted a glass of champagne and exchanged pleasantries with Lord Wrexham, who remained loyally at her side despite her earlier refusal. "You are pale," he murmured. "We can leave whenever you wish." "I am perfectly well," she lied. The Duke's gaze found her across the room. He had not approached her since entering, but the weight of his attention was a physical pressure. Dressed in black and white with a sapphire waistcoat, he looked every inch the powerful peer, and yet she saw the tightness around his mouth, the set of his shoulders that spoke of a decision already made. The orchestra struck up a waltz. A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. The waltz was still considered daring, and to dance it with a particular partner signaled intention. The Duke excused himself from his solicitor and began to walk. The sea of guests parted, expectation parting like water before a prow. Miss Bexley's smile bloomed, her hand already half extended. The Duke walked past her. He did not pause, did not glance. The smile on Miss Bexley's face froze and then crumbled into bewilderment. Lady Bexley's mouth opened, a silent cry of outrage. Helena saw him coming and knew, with a certainty that turned her limbs to stone, what he intended. She stepped back, but Lord Wrexham's arm was no shield. The Duke stopped before her, his gray eyes holding a fire she had never seen, reckless, determined, terrifying. "Miss Ashworth," his voice carried, "will you do me the honor of this dance?" The ballroom hushed, every painted fan stilled. Helena heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere to her left, Lady Bexley perhaps, or the Dowager Duchess. Lord Wrexham's arm tensed under her hand. "Your Grace," she breathed, "you cannot. The announcement." "I am making it." He extended his hand, palm up, an offering and a challenge. Helena did not take it. She stared at his outstretched fingers, and 1,000 calculations raced through her mind. The ruin of his estate, the vengeance of the Bexleys, the scandal that would swallow her whole whether she danced or refused. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper meant only for him, fierce as a blade against his ear. "Let go of my hand." He did not let go. Instead, he turned his head toward the assembled crowd, and his voice rang out with the clarity of a bell struck at midnight. "Too late." The single word fell into the silence and spread like ink in water. Then the Duke raised his voice further, addressing the room with the authority of a man who had just burned every bridge behind him. "I have made my choice. Miss Ashworth is my choice. There will be no other announcement this evening." Chaos erupted. The Dowager Duchess swayed and had to be supported by a footman. Miss Bexley let out a single, keening cry and fled toward the terrace, her mother storming after her with a face like thunder. The orchestra, unsure, faltered into silence. Lord Wrexham stepped back from Helena, his expression a mixture of shock and pained understanding. Helena stood at the center of the maelstrom, her hand still not in the Duke. He had not forced her fingers. His own remained extended, waiting. The entire ton stared, and she felt the heat of 100 judgments searing her skin. She had whispered for him to release her, and he had answered by binding them together in the most public way imaginable. It was an act of monumental arrogance. It was also, she realized with a lurch of her heart, the only currency he had left, the truth, thrown at the world's feet. "You impossible man," she said, low and shaking. "Yes," he replied just as quietly, "but I have asked in my fashion. Now it is your turn to answer. Will you dance with me, Helena, here in front of them all?" The waltz waited. The ton held its breath. And Helena Ashworth, who had been overlooked, mocked, and counted as nothing, lifted her chin and placed her hand in his. The touch was cool, steady, a deliberate acceptance of the gauntlet he had thrown not at her, but at the entire gilded world. The orchestra, cued by a frantic wave from the conductor, struck up the waltz again. The Duke led her onto the floor and they began to move. The crowd's whispers rose like the roar of a distant sea. Helena did not smile. She did not look at the Bexleys, at the Dowager, at anyone but the man whose hand held hers. The storm was only beginning. The waltz ended in a profound and terrible silence. No one applauded. The Duke released her waist but did not release her hand. Instead, he led her from the floor through a gauntlet of frozen expressions. Helena caught sight of the Dowager Duchess, her face leached of color, supported by 2 companions. Miss Bexley was nowhere to be seen, but her mother's voice cut through the hush from the terrace doorway. "This is an insult to our entire bloodline. You will answer for this, Ashcombe." The Duke did not break stride. He guided Helena into a small antechamber lined with books and shut the door. The room was lit by a single branch of candles, their flames trembling in the draught. She pulled her hand from his grasp and whirled to face him. "You had no right." Her voice was steady, which surprised her. Inside, a tempest raged, humiliation, fury, and a traitorous thread of something that felt perilously like hope. "You did not ask me. You informed the entire world as if I were a parcel you had claimed at auction. I told you to let go. And I said it was too late." He stood with his back to the door, his face a mask of strained composure. "I meant it. Too late to pretend I could marry Miss Bexley. Too late to pretend you are nothing to me. Too late to ask in quiet, respectable words when my entire life has been quiet, respectable misery." He stepped toward her and the candlelight caught the exhaustion beneath his eyes. "I have been asking, Helena, in the conservatory, on the terrace, in your garden." You demanded that I ask truly. I did, in the only way left to me that could not be mistaken or retracted. You humiliated me, she whispered. You made me a spectacle. Every tongue in London will call me a schemer who trapped a duke. My mother will bear the whispers. Lord Wrexham, who has been nothing but kind, was made to look a fool, and you stand there and call it an act of asking. The duke's composure cracked. I know what I have done. I know the cost, to you most of all. But I would rather face a lifetime of scandal with you than one more day of empty duty without you. That is the arithmetic I should have learned long ago. Helena stared at him, and the anger in her chest warred with the raw sincerity in his voice. She thought of the steward's letter, the sold timber, the creditors circling. She thought of Miss Bexley's shattered expectations and Lady Bexley's venom. And she thought of the walled garden, the nightingale, the way he had looked at her as though she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. You may have just destroyed yourself, she said. The Bexleys will call in every social debt. Your creditors will hear of this and press harder. Your family will not forgive you. I know. And still you did it. Still, his voice dropped to a rough murmur. I would do it again. I would do it 100 times in 100 ballrooms until you understood that you are not a variable in my arithmetic. You are the sum. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the tears she had refused all evening blurred the candle flames into halos. I will not marry a man who makes decisions for me. If there is to be a future, it will be built on something other than grand gestures and public declarations. You will learn to ask. You will learn to wait. And I will learn whether I can trust a man who has spent his life barricaded behind his title. The Duke nodded, a single, slow movement. Then I will learn, teach me. Helena did not answer. She moved past him, opened the door, and stepped back into the corridor. The ballroom still churned with scandalized noise. Lord Wrexham was waiting near the cloakroom, his face pale but resolute. I will escort you home, he said, and his voice allowed no refusal. She took his arm and left the Duke standing in the doorway of the antechamber, his figure framed by candlelight. She did not look back. As the carriage pulled away from Grosvenor Square, Helena pressed her forehead to the cool glass and let the tears come at last, not of defeat, but of a woman who had just walked away from a duke and in doing so had claimed a power she had never known she possessed. 3 days of rain followed the ball, as though London itself wished to wash away the scandal. Helena remained at home, receiving no callers except a brief, painful visit from Lord Wrexham. He had come to offer marriage again, his voice gentle and his eyes knowing. I can give you protection, he said. A quiet life far from the ton's memory, you would want for nothing. She had taken his hand and pressed it with genuine affection. You deserve a wife who loves you, Philip. I hold you too dear to give you less than that. Please believe me. He had believed her. He had kissed her forehead and gone. A good man who deserved more than a woman whose heart was entangled with a reckless duke. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. Sunlight slanted through the parlor windows as Helena sorted embroidery silks, an occupation that required just enough attention to keep dark thoughts at bay. The knock at the front door was not unexpected. Her mother was at the market, and when the maid announced the Duke of Ashcombe, Helena felt her pulse stumble and then right itself. He entered the parlor with none of the swagger she remembered. His coat was plain, his cravat simply tied, and his face carried the marks of sleepless nights. In his hand he held a leather portfolio. Miss Ashworth, he bowed, and it was a proper, formal bow devoid of presumption. I have come to make an accounting. She gestured to a chair. Explain. He sat and opened the portfolio. Inside were documents, letters from his solicitor, statements of debt, records of land sales. I have sold the unentailed property in Derbyshire. It was my mother's jointure land. She is furious, but it was mine to sell. The proceeds will discharge the most pressing creditors and leave a modest income. I am no longer a wealthy man, but I am an honest one. He paused, meeting her eyes. Miss Bexley's family has been offered a formal apology and a settlement for the broken understanding. It cost me more than I could afford, but it was necessary. I would not have her suffer for my choices." Helena listened without interrupting. This was a different man from the one who had grabbed her hand in a crowded ballroom. This man was scraped clean of arrogance, his voice carrying the weight of actions rather than words. "And what of me?" she asked quietly. "What of what I suffered? What of my reputation, which you set alight without my consent?" He flinched but held her gaze. "Your reputation is my deepest regret. I can offer you my name, if you will have it, but I will not offer it as a command. I am here to ask, Helena. Properly this time. Not because the ton expects it, not because I have trapped you, but because I cannot imagine a future in which you are not the first face I see each morning." He withdrew a single sheet of paper from the portfolio, covered in his own handwriting. "I have written down what I should have said from the beginning. May I read it?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He read aloud, his tone measured and clear. The letter was not a love poem. It was an honest catalogue of his faults, his fears, and his hopes. He wrote of the walled garden, of the steward's letter, of the way she had refused to be a symbol and demanded to be seen. He wrote that he had no right to ask for her hand, but he was asking anyway, with the understanding that she might refuse, and that if she did, he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of a second chance. When he finished, the parlor was silent. Helena's embroidery hoop lay forgotten in her lap. Outside, a sparrow chirped in the dripping eaves. "You have learned to ask," she said at last. Her voice was thick. "That is more than I hoped for." He laid the letter on the tea table between them. "I have more to learn. I will spend a lifetime learning if you will let me." Helena looked at the letter, at the portfolio of sold land and settled debts, at the man who had dismantled his own pride and presented the pieces in pen and ink. She thought of the nightingale, the lavender, the whispered words that had started it all. "I will not give you an answer today," she said. "You asked me to teach you patience. Now I will ask the same of you. Court me, your grace, properly, in full view of the ton, with respect and restraint. Let them see that I am not a scandal to be managed, but a choice you make every day. If at the end of the season I believe that you have changed, not performed change but lived it, then I will give you my answer." The Duke exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. "That is more than I deserve." "It is," she agreed, but a small smile touched her lips. "Consider it your first lesson." He rose, bowed again, and walked to the door. There he paused and looked back at her. "Thank you, Helena, for not letting go." She did not reply, but after he had gone, she picked up the letter he had written and read it again, and again. And when her mother came home, she found her daughter sitting by the window with a sheet of paper pressed to her heart, smiling at the rain-washed sunlight as though spring had arrived early. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet persistence. The ton, ever eager for fresh scandal, watched the Duke of Ashcombe's courtship of Miss Ashworth with predatory fascination. They expected spectacle, grand gestures, defiant declarations, another public scene. What they received was something far more disarming: consistency. The Duke called at the Ashworth residence every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, never overstaying the prescribed 15 minutes of a formal visit. He sent small, thoughtful tokens: a volume of poetry she had mentioned in passing, a nosegay of lavender from his own greenhouse, a letter that arrived with the Morning Post and contained nothing more momentous than a description of the sunrise over the Thames. He attended the same gatherings she attended and did not monopolize her. He danced with other young ladies, spoke civilly to their mothers, and never once looked at Helena with anything resembling possession. The Dowager Duchess, after a month of icy silence, began to thaw. She appeared at a garden party where Helena was present and engaged her in a conversation about roses. It was stilted, cautious, but it was a beginning. Lady Bexley remained implacable, cutting Helena dead at every encounter, but the edge of her power had dulled. The broken betrothal, once a scandal, had become old news. The ton moved on to fresher gossip: an elopement, a card sharp exposed, a baronet's wife caught in indiscretion. One evening in late June, the Duke invited Helena and her mother to a small dinner at Ashcombe House. The guest list was intimate: the Dowager, a few close friends, and a smattering of relatives who had been persuaded to set aside their disapproval. After the meal, the Duke asked Helena to walk with him in the newly restored garden. The walled enclosure, modeled, she realized with a start, on her own father's lavender garden, sloped down to a reflecting pool. Lanterns hung from the branches of a young oak, their light trembling on the water. He stopped near the pool and turned to her. The months had carved new lines around his mouth, but his eyes were clearer, steadier than she had ever seen them. "I have kept my word," he said. "I have not rushed you. I have not demanded. But the season ends next week, and I must ask one final time." Helena's heart beat a slow, measured rhythm. The night air smelled of lavender and damp stone, and a nightingale, perhaps the very same from her own garden, began to sing in the hedge. "Ask then." He did not kneel. He did not produce a ring. He simply took her hand, his fingers cool and steady, and looked into her eyes. "Helena Ashworth, I am a man who was lost in his own arrogance and found only because you refused to let me remain there. I have no fortune to offer, no grand estate, only a name that is now humble and a heart that is yours. Will you marry me? Not because I have trapped you, not because the ton expects it, but because you choose me, because you want to." She let the silence stretch, watching the lantern light dance in his gray eyes. Then she smiled, a true smile, the one she had guarded for so long, and lifted her free hand to his cheek. "I choose you, Alexander. I have chosen you since the moment you called me a fern and meant it as a compliment." He laughed, a sound of pure, unguarded relief, and pulled her into an embrace that was fierce and tender all at once. When they drew apart, he cupped her face and kissed her with a reverence that spoke of promises kept and battles won. Their engagement was announced not in a ballroom but in the Gazette, a simple notice that read, "The Duke of Ashcombe and Miss Helena Ashworth are pleased to announce their betrothal." The ton read it, speculated, and eventually accepted that the scandal had transformed into something unremarkably happy. They married in the village church near Ashcombe's remaining estate, a modest affair with wild flowers and sunlight. Helena walked down the aisle on the arm of Lord Wrexham, who had insisted on the honor with a warmth that healed the last of their awkwardness. The Duke waited at the altar, and when the priest asked him to take her hand, he did so with a gentleness that made the Dowager Duchess dab her eyes. Helena placed her hand in his freely, no hesitation, no whispered plea to let go. And as they turned to face the small congregation of friends and family, the Duke looked at his wife with a gratitude so profound it silenced every lingering doubt. The nightingale sang again that evening. In the garden of the manor they would fill with lavender. And Helena, standing at the window with her husband's arm around her waist, thought of the ballroom, the whisper, the single word that had changed everything. "Too late," he had said. But she knew now, with a certainty that rested in her bones like a stone worn smooth by water, that it had not been too late at all. It had been, in every way that mattered, the precise, perfect moment to begin.